Good afternoon. I'm Alan Solomont, the Dean of Tufts University's Jonathan M. Tisch College of Civic Life, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to today's conversation with Robert Putnam and Shaylyn Romney Garrett about their new book, The Upswing: How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again. I want to thank our co-sponsors for this event, Jumbo Vote, the Political Science Department, and the Civic Studies program, which is led by the Associate Dean of Tisch College, Peter Levine. And it offers a first-of-its-kind major in Civic Studies to Tufts undergraduates. I also want to thank Professor Putnam and Ms. Romney Garrett for being with us this evening. They are the most recent guest speakers in an impressive lineup that Tisch College has hosted this semester. They have included Pete Buttigieg, Deval Patrick, Van Jones, Yamiche Alcindor, Ijeoma Oluo, Latosha Brown, Congressman Joe Kennedy, and most recently last week, Congressman Adam Schiff. You can watch the video of any of these events on the Tisch College YouTube channel. And this Friday, I hope you'll join us for another Tisch College Distinguished Speaker Series talk featuring actor, director, and most importantly, Tufts alumnus, Hank Azaria. So go to tischcollege.tufts.edu/events for full details and to register for that event. I have a feeling that Hank Azaria will bring some much needed levity as we near the end of a semester, which has taken place under rather unprecedented circumstances and has been difficult and challenging for students and faculty. It is also a time when we have grappled with some of the most pressing political, racial, legal, and environmental challenges facing our country. The battles over these and other issues have revealed how badly frayed the civic fabric of our nation is. We have experienced over the past years, if not over the past decades, and we saw evidence of this in this month's contentious presidential election and in its aftermath. As we put the outcome of that election behind us, it's time to ask, where do we go from here? How do we get there? And most importantly, how do we get there together? In their book, The Upswing: How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again, our guests today answer those questions, calling on lessons from the country's past, using their deep scholarly expertise, and based on the practical experience of what has worked in communities across America. Robert Putnam has been called America's Poet Laureate of Civil Society. He is the Malkin Research Professor of Public Policy at Harvard University, where he has also served as the Dean of the Kennedy School of Government, the Associate Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and the Director of the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. A brilliant thinker and among the most influential political scientists of the last half-century, Dr. Putnam has advised national and grassroots leaders on both sides of the aisle and on both sides of the Atlantic, including Presidents Clinton, Bush, and Obama, British Prime Ministers Blair and Cameron, and Prime Ministers in Ireland, Finland, Singapore, and South Korea. He has written 15 books, including the New York Times bestseller, Our Kids, The American Dream in Crisis, and Bowling Alone, The Collapse and Revival of American Community. You might say that Bowling Alone, when it was published 20 years ago, first sounded the alarm about the loss of social capital in American communities and helped put civic engagement on the front burner of our nation's agenda. This, in turn, was the reason for the creation of the Tisch College of Civic Life, for which I feel deeply indebted to Bob Putnam. Professor Putnam has received 18 honorary degrees from universities in 8 countries, and in 2013, he was awarded the National Humanities Medal, which is the nation's highest honor for contributions to the humanities. He was awarded it by President Obama. Bob Putnam's co-author, Shaylyn Romney Garrett, is an author and an experienced social entrepreneur with a unique global outlook on the issue of building community. She is a founding contributor to the Aspen Institute's initiative, Weave, the Social Fabric Project. With her husband, James Garrett, Shaylyn co-founded Think Unlimited, a non-profit venture working to catalyze social innovation in the Middle East. She lived in the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan for 6 years, during which time she partnered with Queen Rania Al Abdullah to bring an original Arabic language curriculum on creativity and critical thinking to Jordanian public schools. Shaylyn's work has been featured in the New York Times, Fast Company, Harvard Business Review, and Arab Investor. In 2011, she was honored with the prestigious Draper Richards Kaplan Social Entrepreneurship Fellowship. Joining Bob and Shaylyn in conversation tonight is our very own Dr. Peter Levine. Peter is the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and the Lincoln Filene Professor of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Tisch College. He also holds faculty appointments in the departments of philosophy and political science, as well as at the Tufts Clinical and Translational Sciences Institute. Peter is responsible for bringing to Tufts and to Tisch College CIRCLE, the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, which is the nation's leading authority on the civic and political engagement of our nation's young people. One of the nation's leading scholars in the field of civic studies, Peter leads the Civic Studies major here at Tufts, and he teaches the Summer Institute of Civic Studies and organizes the annual Frontiers of Democracy conference at Tufts. He is the author of 7 books, including his most recent one, We Are the Ones We Have Been Waiting For, The Promise of Civic Renewal in America. A graduate of Yale University and Oxford University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar, Peter is the intellectual and academic leader of Tisch College and sits at the center of our desire to be the academic home for the next generation of Bob Putnams. I know we're all looking forward to hearing from Peter and Shaylyn and Bob to share their insights about the current civic life of our country. So let me turn things over to my esteemed colleague, Peter Levine.
Thanks, Alan, and thanks everybody for joining us. And you'll see that I even try to dress like Bob Putnam. Here we match. Hoping that, yeah. So we should get soon to Shaylyn and Bob presenting their book, which they're going to do very effectively because they're terrific at it. And the argument of the book is very valuable. I did actually, Shaylyn, with apologies to you because you're the co-author and equal presenter, I did want to say something about Bob since he's here in our house. And Alan gave a lot of details, so I won't go into much, but the point would really be that this is the house that in many ways Bob Putnam built. It's sort of indirectly. You're not responsible for the bad parts, but you're responsible for the inspiration. So, I mean, to be a bit autobiographical, if I may, and I've been looking forward to doing this in this setting. 25 years ago, I was a philosophy PhD, very idealistic, and wanted to make America's government more ethical. So I went to work for a Common Cause, which is a lobby for ethics in government. And I'm glad I did. And you should all join. It's an important organization. But I was there for just 2 years and a dramatic thing happened. When I first got there, we had 250,000 members and we would only take money up to $20 from each member, no other form of money at all. We didn't allow tax deductions for the contributions. And the members were very active as they were in local and state organizations. By the time I'd left, and I don't think it was my fault, it was only 2 years and I was a junior staffer, but we had lost about half our members and unfortunately a bunch of them to death because the median age was very high. And basically people had joined in the 1970s. So 2 years after I left, or 1 year, the article version of Bowling Alone came out, Bob Putnam's first book, explaining this, and it had a sort of profound effect on me because I realized that you can't have good government unless the people are organized and the people are not organizing. So I sort of studied that for the rest of my life. One step was this thing called the National Commission on Civic Renewal, which got founded really to discuss the argument that Bob Putnam was making, and I was the deputy director. One of the recommendations of that commission was to create Circle, and so that's why we created Circle, which is now led by my successor, Kay Kawashima Ginsburg, but which I brought here. And then, especially since Alan came over as head of, as our dean of Tisch College, we've built around Circle a lot more research, but all of it really aiming to solve the problem that Bob diagnosed and that I experienced. And I'm going to shut up and turn it over, except to say, so I've also taught Bob Putnam, many times to many students. And so I know every single argument that they can make against your work, as well as all the defenses, because I typically end up defending it. But the two things that I think people wouldn't realize just from reading is, one, this is an exemplary scientist in the sense that everything he says is a hypothesis that he wants to test and check and consider. And so he loves arguments and he changes his mind. And so he's not, the beliefs that he has in a particular moment are not crystallized. They're in dynamic interaction with other people to an exemplary extent. But the other thing is the moral commitment. So, and the moral uplift is central to this book, and it's more explicit maybe than in previous work, but this has all been a moral cause. This is not data crunching for the sake of data crunching. So, and I've always appreciated that, but more so with this last work. So that's what I wanted to say. And I'm just glad you're both here. And for now on, I'm not talking only about Bob, it's Shaylyn too. But I think my first question was really just for you guys to talk about the book, which you do so ably. So just to let people know what it's about. It's a fantastic book and they should know what the argument is.
First of all, Peter and Alan, I don't know quite how to respond to that set of introductions. I suppose when you get to be a certain age, you worry about how people are going to think of you. And I would actually like to record, Peter and Alan, what you just said. Especially, Peter, what you said at the end about trying to do both serious science and to try to change the world, because that actually is, that's the way I like to think of my career, that I've tried, at least the last half of my career, to try to do that. If we have a slide, we're going to try to go through as quickly as we can the basic argument of this book. I'm going to start and then Shaylyn will follow. And the story of this book is actually captured on the cover, because you see on the cover, we want to change America, and we think we've figured out a way in which we can help other people, guide other people to ways to fix Americans' problems. And the underlying data, and there is a lot of data in this book. I'm not going to go through all the data at all. There are tons and tons of graphs and charts and so on, but the underlying data in this book forms a curve, just like the curve you see on the chart, on the cover of the book. Let me see if I get a running start. If we have the next slide, a running start of what the book is about. America today is, to use a technical term that my mother would have used, America's in a pickle. America is reached historic levels of anxiety and discontent along many different measures. Most obviously, I suppose, we've reached historic levels of political polarization. We are about as, I will say something more about the data in a second, but we are about as polarized politically as we have ever been in our national history, with the possible exception of the Civil War. So this is a really big deal. And separately and independently, we've reached almost the highest level of economic inequality in our nation's history, and very high levels of social isolation, or low levels of what I have come to call social capital. And finally, and again, this is sort of independent, but it's also true, we're about as culturally self-centered and narcissistic as our country has ever been. So the question is, the first question that we're trying to answer in this book is, how did we get here? How did we get in this pickle? And I want to show you now some charts that show you the trends over the last 125 years in each of these 4 basic themes or variables. If we have the next slide, I'm going to start here with economic equality. All these graphs are oriented so that up means more equal or less polarized or more connected or more culturally focused on we. This is the economic chart of economic equality, and it's a summary basically of a lot of different measures. I wish I had time to go through all the measures because I love the fact that we've got in each of these graphs, behind the graph lies probably a half dozen or maybe even a dozen measures of economic equality, but they all tell the same story, and here's the story. These data begin in 1913. That's because that's when the Internal Revenue Service was formed, and that's when we begin to get good hard data on the distribution of income in America and distribution of wealth. And as you can see, at the beginning of the 20th century, America was about as unequal as we have ever been in our national history, certainly in recent terms. It was called the Gilded Age. And that was the period in which, if you think about it in descriptive terms, there was a huge gap between the mansions on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, which is where Rockefellers and the Mellons and all the other captains of industry lived, and just probably 10 miles south on the Lower East Side of New York, rampant poverty and slums populated by immigrants, lots and lots of immigrants, lots of uneducated immigrants. They could have been immigrants to New York from Iowa, or they could have been immigrants to New York, the US from Russia or from Italy, but enormous gap. And that's the world in 1910. If you look there, beginning in 1910, however, the trend begins to move in a different direction. We begin to become somewhat more equal up until about 1920. As you see, after 1920 and during the decade of the 20s, that's sometimes called the Roaring 20s, there was a bit of a dip, and you want to remember that dip. But then coming out, even before the Great Depression, which starts in 1930, the really onset of the Great Depression is in 1929 or 1930. But even before that, there's a significant increase in economic equality. Of course, it's still low in absolute terms, but the trend is toward greater equality. And that trend continues. It continues through the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. And after World War II, you can see a little bit of a peak, a little bit of a dip there. But then even after World War II, up until the 50s and into the 60s, America was more and more equal, basically until that's rising until the early 60s, but then suddenly begins to go in the other direction, and actually it continues to go in the other direction for another half century. Sometimes it's accelerating down, sometimes it's plunging down, as you can see. Sometimes, if we pause in 1980, sometimes people think that movement toward inequality was somehow associated with Ronald Reagan, but you can see that by the time Ronald Reagan is elected in 1980, we're already well away. We've already begun to increase economic inequality or decrease economic equality. And over at the far right of the graph, we come to today. The data in this book turns out to ended in 2015, but actually we know what it's like in the next 5 years after that, which is mostly the Trump years, because of the tax cuts and so on, the other policies of the Trump administration. That graph continues to go further down. So by the time we get actually to real data from 2020, we're back where we began 125 years ago, with very high levels of inequality. And most people know about this chart because people have been talking about growing inequality now for 10 or 15 years. But this shows you what it looks like across this whole century. Let's go to the next chart, which looks in turn at political comedy, we're calling it, bipartisanship. And the opposite is political polarization. And let's start again over there. You see around 1900, America was very polarized politically, very, very little bipartisan cooperation in that period. But then isn't that interesting? Beginning around 1910, we begin to move upwards and become somewhat more bipartisan, cooperative in bipartisan terms. And you can see just what that graph looks like during the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s, up until the middle 60s, where we reach a peak in bipartisan collaboration, middle 50s actually, and that's when Eisenhower is president. It's perfectly appropriate that Eisenhower was, except for George Washington, the least partisan president in American history. But it still stays, even after that, it still stays up pretty high, lots of bipartisan cooperation, even for the Great Society, you can see there. But then suddenly it begins to drift downward. And for the first time in a long time, we become more polarized. And then it seems like it was going to stop, but it doesn't. It just keeps going down and down and down. And by the time you reach today, it turns out we're about as polarized politically as we could be. I'm not going to go through the details, but in the years since 2015, that is over the last 5 years, we've reached almost the maximum level, mathematically the maximum level of political polarization. Well, let's go quickly to the next slide to show you a little bit about what the data looks like on what I sometimes call social capital. That is the degree to which people are connected with one another. This is a measure of a lot of things, including the degree to which people are members of civic organizations, members of religious congregations, whether they take part in civic life. This is the kind of thing that the Tisch program and the Tisch school has focused on. It's really important. Obviously, I think it's important. And the measure also includes things like connections, even in the most intimate circles, the degree to which we form strong, enduring ties with other members of our immediate family. So those are the things we mean, and also social trust. So those are the things that we're measuring over this period. Let's go back to the beginning of the data now, 1890. Now it's beginning to get a little boring. Back down in 1890, America is pretty lacking in social cohesion. And if you want to figure out, well, how is that? Fundamentally, it's because that was just at the end of the most rapid period of industrialization in American history. And the older forms of connecting that had worked when we mostly were in rural areas, that is barn raisings and quilting bees, didn't cut it on the Lower East Side of New York or in Detroit or in Chicago. And therefore, at that period, we'd just taken a huge hit to our social connections. But then again, look at that. Coming out in around 1900, 1910, we begin to form new forms of connection. And in a minute, Shaylyn will tell you more about that look like in practical terms. But you can see through the 20s, again, we're increasing our social connection. We're marrying more often, and I mean, we're getting married, and we're getting married early and having kids, and so on. Then there's a pause. Again, that pause in the 20s, an interesting puzzle. But then coming out of that in the 30s and especially in the 40s, and actually especially after 1945, probably the greatest civic boom in American history. Every year, millions of Americans joined more groups. They joined bowling leagues, and they joined the Kiwanis Club, and they joined guard groups, and they had kids. That's the period of the baby booms. And then you see that, but that rises, and then suddenly, in the middle 60s, silently and mysteriously sort of, that begins to turn down. And you see that therefore for the next, half century, from 1970 certainly down to 2020, that degree of American social cohesion just begins to collapse in an almost linear way. Now, one thing I have to say as the author of Bowling Alone was written in the year 2000. If you point at the graph at the year 2000, that's where Bowling Alone ended. And Bowling Alone, as Peter said, was meant to be a clarion call saying our social fabric is coming apart. And you could see, boy, that I didn't intend that to be a prediction, but the next, back up a little bit, please. That is all data we've added since Bowling Alone, and you can see it just has continued to plunge. So now let's go to the fourth dimension that we want to focus on here. This is cultural solidarity or cultural connectedness, the degree to which we are kind of in our culture and in our the way we think about our nation, whether we're focused on a we or on an I. And I wish I had more time to go over the details of measuring cultural solidarity, because behind this graph, you're just going to have to trust me for the moment, although I'm happy to answer questions. Behind this graph lie a lot of different, really hard quantitative measures of the degree to which Americans have felt and acted as if we were separate, isolated individuals, or instead were connected with one another. And as you can see, again, the story now gets a little embarrassing because it's the same story. Basically, at the end of the 19th century, Americans were very much, let's put it, an I society. But then coming out of that period, once again, you see in the 1920s and 1930s, again, there's that pause at the end around 20, 25, 30. But then again, we become steadily more focused on the fact that we're connected with one another. And finally, we hit the peak there in 1964, when we're at a kind of the most extended focus, the most we kind of society that America has ever had. Now, of course, we're going to need to ask, well, who is we? And Shaylyn's going to talk about that in just a second. But you can see, same basic picture, downhill from that same date, steadily becoming less and less focused on we, more and more focused on I, and more narcissistic. Now, this is not a political talk, but there are some people who think of Trump as the narcissist in chief. But one thing you can notice from this graph, and I hope you see it very clearly, this graph says this problem we're talking about did not begin with Donald Trump. Trump arrives very late in this process. And what that means is Donald Trump did not cause this problem these problems we're talking about. He may embody narcissism, but he did not cause this 50-year trend in declining, in an increasing focus on I. That somehow was driven by deeper factors. Okay, now I want to summarize very quickly what we've said so far, and then turn this over to Shaylyn. If we have the next slide, I've just put all of those charts together on one chart so you can see. Then you can see separately, there's the chart there's the economics trend that we looked at, and the politics trend, and the social trend, and the cultural trend. And you can see they are all one trend. And we're now calling this the I curve, because we start off in around 1900 in a very I period in American history, selfish and unequal and polarized and disconnected. We become a we in the 1960s. Notice that that's well past the World War II period. Well, maybe we'll want to come back to that later, to the degree to which all of this is dependent just on wars. It turns out it's not. But then you can see it goes down steadily to I, and all these graphs are all these data sets are so consistent, we can put them in one graph. And that's the next slide. The next slide is, we call it from community to individualism, and then, from individualism up to community, and then back to individualism. And Shaylyn, why don't you pick this up now, talking about what lies behind all these data charts of mine, and what really was going on in the society, and what the implications of these trends are for our own choices.
Sure. So as Bob mentioned briefly earlier, one of the first questions that we would have to ask when we're talking about the American we is, who is included in that we? If we're looking at this graph and saying, okay, well, the first 2/3 of the 20th century were America's we decades, we can be defined in more inclusive or exclusive terms. So what kind of we were we talking about here? And this is something that we look at extensively in the book. And I want to just give you the briefest summary here of some of the data that we present in the book related to race. First of all, I think what we're looking at when you see all these different graphs that Bob has presented is trends, right? Trends over time. So when you ask the question, well, what did the trend in terms of racial equality look like during this same period? Were we moving toward more racial equality, or were we not? Usually when we tend to think about that in the 20th century in America, we tend to think that before the Civil Rights Movement, before the 1960s, that sort of all was stagnation, oppression, exclusion for Black Americans specifically over that period. So instead of an inverted U curve, which is what we often refer to these graphs as, it would look a bit more like a hockey stick. Flat, zero progress for most of the century until we get to the 1960s, and there's sort of this lightning bolt change toward more inclusion and more equality. That's a common historical narrative that we tend to think of when we think of the 20th century in terms of race. In many ways, that's true. For example, when we think about the long-standing lack of equity in Black political representation, the long delay of Black Americans entering professional schools and professions, white supremacy in mainstream media and culture, and entrenched residential segregation. Those are all examples of areas in which there was very little progress until the 1960s. However, when we began to look at more data, we found a couple of surprises. So if we could go to the next slide here. What we see is that this is a summary index of Black-white material equality over this same period, roughly the 20th century, including up till today. Now, when you look at this graph, you can see that on the y-axis, it goes up to 1.0, which represents approximate equality. So the question is when and how were we trending toward equality between the races? You can see here that over the course of the century, we never got anywhere close to full equality, but there were periods in which we were making more progress and less progress, and that's what we want to talk about. And just briefly, when we're talking about material equality, we're talking about things like life expectancy, infant mortality, as well as other measures of health. We're talking about high school and college enrollment and completion, earnings per worker, household wealth, which includes homeownership. We're also talking about voter registration and voter participation. So were we approaching equality toward those things between Blacks and whites, and when? And I should just pause here to say that our data does not include all different peoples of color, mostly because data, we're looking at long run data that go back to 1900, and data on Latinos or other peoples of color were not available as separate groups during this period. So this is why we're focusing on Blacks versus whites. So what was the trend? If it's not a hockey stick, what are we seeing here? We're actually seeing a surprising amount of progress before the civil rights movement. For example, income gains by race converged at the greatest rate between 1940 and 1970. The racial gap in homeownership declined steadily narrowed between 1900 and 1970. There was a dramatic increase in the South in Black voter registration between 1940 and 1970. So what these data reveal is a too slow and insufficient, but nonetheless unmistakable, decades-long drive toward equality, in the direction of equality during the first 2/3 of the century. And then we can see right there, right in 1970, if you can put the pointer there, we see that progress basically stops. What we call this subsequent period in the book is America's foot off the gas period. We were driving toward racial equality, then all of a sudden that drive stagnates. And in many cases, even reverses. When you look at homeownership, just as one example, rates of Black homeownership today are actually lower than they were in 1968 when the Fair Housing Act passed. This is a real surprise. So this graph begs a couple of questions. First of all, when we know that the backdrop of this was Jim Crow, was ongoing racial exclusion, how was it that Black Americans were making progress toward equality during that period of Jim Crow? And then why, when the dam of legal exclusion was finally broken with the civil rights movement, did that progress stagnate? So the first question has a somewhat simple, though tragic answer, which is simply, let's go first to the question of how Black Americans were making progress during that first 2/3 of the century. The main answer here is actually the Great Migration. Black Americans were standing up by the millions to claim their place within the American we, and that meant migrating out of the violent and exclusionary South to the slightly more hospitable North and West in America. And granted, they were getting access to better jobs, better educational opportunities, better access to healthcare in segregated environments. So this was a racialized we, but nonetheless, it was a we in which more and more Black Americans were finding a way to participate. And in many ways, the social capital boom during this period was driven not just by white social capitalists, but by Black Americans as well, who were creating enormous civil society organizations, churches, founding colleges, all sorts of things. Again, highly racialized, but nonetheless a very important part of the story of America's we decades. So why then didn't this trend toward racial equality continue? Again, the story here is this moment of the 1960s, 1970s. We saw the civil rights movement, and we also saw a huge white backlash to the civil rights movement. White Americans were all well and good with the passage of civil rights legislation sort of in principle. And it's true also that that legislation passed during the peak of this American we period. So that makes sense that we had slowly been building toward this sort of fragile national consensus around race. And that was the moment that we were able to achieve these watershed changes. But the survey data show quite clearly that when push came to shove and it was time to make some rearrangements so that equal opportunity was a reality, white Americans were much less in favor of that. And there was a huge backlash. And so, you know, it's important to note here that this is not a story that's unknown to Black Americans. This is not just a graph to Black Americans. This is the contours of their own genealogy. This, on the other hand, is somewhat of a surprise to white Americans, because I think a lot of white Americans say, oh, the civil rights movement, you know, we passed all this great legislation and things have just been getting better and better for Black Americans since then. The reality is that that's not the case. And when we look at the Black Lives Matter protests today, where we are being called to really face the systemic racism of our country, this is, of course, about police brutality and police killings of Black men and women, but also that's taking place against this backdrop of intergenerational stagnation. That's really important to understand where that frustration is coming from. So again, there's a lot more detail that we go through in the book here, but we just wanted to give a sense of the fact that it's interesting that when America took our foot off the gas in driving toward racial equality, this happened to coincide with the moment when America more broadly turned from we to I. So whether that broader turn from we to I was driven by white backlash, or whether the white backlash was driven by this broader cultural trend from we to I, it's difficult to say, but these two phenomena were certainly intertwined. And that has a lot to do with the lessons that we can learn from the I we I curve. So let's actually just go back one slide to this I we I curve one more time. Go forward one more, sorry, there we go. So as Bob and I were thinking about how to present this data, what we didn't want to do is to give the impression that we wanted to somehow hark back to some supposed golden age in American history that we need to recreate today. This is not a Make America Great Again thesis, right? Why? Well, largely because of the racialized nature of the we that America had built to during that period, as well as many other negative phenomena that we go over in the book, such as conformity and other things like that. So what is the lesson of this I we I curve? Well, what we want to look to is the moment when America was most similar to where we are today, which was that original Gilded Age, the 1900 period in America, where by every measure, we were breathtakingly similar to where we are as a nation today. So if we pulled up and out of that last time, what are the strategic lessons that we could learn for how we might be able to do that again today? So let's just move forward a couple slides here, and I'll go quickly over some of the lessons from that moment when America turned from I to we, the lessons from America's last upswing. Basically, at this time, the Gilded Age, rather than sort of, you know, going off the rails, as many commentators were predicting America might do at that time, it instead turned into the Progressive Era. The Progressive Era was an extraordinarily diverse movement of Americans, and it was characterized by a real moral and cultural shift. There were reformers who were not only calling for public policy changes, but they were calling for changes in our primary conceptions, in the way Americans think about the American project. The Gilded Age was characterized by social Darwinism, a period when the dog-eat-dog survival of the fittest was considered the right way to organize a society, which is a little bit hard to imagine. And reformers came along and said, this is not who we are, and this is not the value system on which we want to build our society. And they called for something called the social gospel, a reorientation of Americans' values toward taking care of our most vulnerable, toward thinking of ourselves as all in this together. And that moral awakening seems to be one of the first things that changed. This being a data-driven thesis, we're often asked, which was the leading indicator? Which thing of all these curves turned upward first? Because if we know that, then maybe we could know which thing we should focus on today. And a lot of people think that it would be economics, that maybe what happened was we addressed the economic inequality first, and then all of the other stuff, the polarization and the narcissism, began to change. Well, it actually looks like the economics was a lagging indicator. And in as much as we can identify a leading indicator, it appears that actually the culture began to shift first, which is really instructive today in terms of where we might want to focus our efforts if we want to see another upswing. We're running out of time here, so I'm going to go quickly through these last points. This was an incredibly youth-driven movement. Sometimes when we think of the progressive era, we think of, photos of Jane Addams when she was receiving the Nobel Peace Prize as an elderly woman. But in fact, Jane Addams and the many other progressives like her were doing some of their most important work in their 20s. This was a very young movement. These young people were facing a world that was unrecognizable to their parents, and they had to create America anew. And that youth-driven vision was extraordinarily innovative. These youth who drove this movement, they saw association as both an end and a means. As Bob mentioned, people were really lonely and dislocated, having moved to cities. They had to invent new ways of bringing people together. They did so, and that created vast stores of social capital. And anyone who's familiar with Bob's work in Bowling Alone will know that that fuels a whole lot of other positive things in a society when you build social capital. So that was a big part of this story. Another thing that these young people did was they innovated solutions to problems, not on a national level, but solutions right outside their doorstep, at the level of the tenement, at the level of the neighborhood, at the level of the city and town. They came up with ideas that then slowly bubbled up and turned into the national programs that we see as the hallmark of the progressive era. There was a really vast ferment of citizen innovation during this period. And again, when we think of the progressive era, we often think of who? Teddy Roosevelt and his square deal, right? Well, Teddy Roosevelt actually was more of a political entrepreneur that sort of saw this parade happening and got out in front of it. It turns out that charismatic leadership lagged. There wasn't some national presidential leader that came along and saved America during this period. Those national leaders who came along built upon the sturdy foundation of this coalition building that had been done by citizens in the previous, decade or two. So there are a lot of lessons in those points that I've made about this previous era in American history. If we want to create another upswing today, we really should look to how they did it last time. The issues are not identical, although in many ways they're very similar, but the strategies might be where we could look for a blueprint for how to move forward today. And of course, one of the biggest lessons is that the we that these progressives were building towards was not inclusive enough. Many of the progressives that we are lauding here were themselves racist, and it's important to point that out very specifically. Some of the systemic racism that we are being forced to grapple with today was actually built into the programs that were created during the last upswing. So in some ways, the upswing had knit into it sort of the seeds of its own demise, in the sense that it kicked full inclusion down the road as something that needed to be dealt with later. And if we want to create another upswing today, we can't make the same mistake. We have to make full inclusion the most important agenda item when we are looking to turn Americans toward one another again in order to create another upswing. So if we can just go quickly to the last slide, we'll leave you with some words from Teddy Roosevelt, who, when he assumed the presidency in 1901, said, "The fundamental rule of our national life, the rule which underlies all others, is that on the whole and in the long run, we shall go up or down together." To a striking degree, these statistical curves that Bob has discovered illustrate this fact in graphic detail, that we are bound together, whether we choose to believe it or not. And we hope that we can begin to believe that again today, that we can exercise our agency as citizens and see America enter another upswing.
Great, thank you, thank you. So that was very well presented. I just finished the book a few days ago, so I can testify to the accuracy of that presentation. We have a few questions in the chat, but I have a bunch I want to ask. So I'm going to ask at least a couple. I might start by just seeing if I've characterized where you stand right, because I think people might be interested in this. So I feel like if somebody said, "Who are they? Are they I don't know. Are they socialists? Are they technocrats? What are they?" I would say. They believe in a balance between communitarian and individualist culture, with a mix of the two, not too communitarian, but not too individualistic. They're intensely pragmatic about how to get there and actually believe in a kind of multiplicity of strategies. And they're skeptical of wholesale social engineering. For example, that there might be some kind of a policy that would get you there. And that the community has to be equitable and inclusive. Would that be a fair a fair summary, or did I leave something out? Is that where you guys stand?
Well, I mean, of course, Peter, everybody else should know that Peter is as much an expert on that period as we are. So we're all a little intimidated by.
No, anyway, this is a where you stand question.
We want to get on to a lot of other questions. So I'll say yes, as a general rule, that's true, Peter. There were a lot of different kinds of people under the rubric of the progressive era. People should know, I mean, listeners should know that the word progressive had a somewhat different meaning then and a broader meaning. There were many progressives on all parts of the political spectrum. And indeed, in 1912, all three presidential candidates presented themselves as progressive. So now the word progressive has become a little narrow to mean sort of left wing. It didn't have that meaning in that period. But beyond that, I think we would agree, Shaylyn, that his summary is pretty accurate.
Yeah, and I love that you bring up pragmatism because, of course, that itself was a movement that was part of the progressive movement, right? Yeah. So the idea of being pragmatic was invented during this era, and we definitely take inspiration from that for sure.
One of the nice ways that they make their case at the end, they have these 4 vignettes of individuals who are part of the movement, and they're nicely diverse in terms of, well, even demographically, but also in their conceptions of what was important. So you have Frances Perkins, a social entrepreneur who becomes a politician, the first female Secretary of Labor. Paul Harris, the founder of the Rotary Club, so which you might think of as very kind of mainstream but part of the process of building social cohesion. Ida B. Wells, the crusading journalist against lynching, and then Tom Johnson, Black, definitely, and then Tom Johnson, a successful rags to riches entrepreneur who becomes mayor of Cleveland and a philanthropist and a social reformer. And perhaps the most dramatic story of success in the book is the high school movement, which you might elaborate on if you want. But this idea that most Americans didn't go to high school, and then a couple decades later, they mostly are going to high school, and it's not because of it's not because of a law, it's not because of a national leader. It's a viral, as you said, it's like either like a brush fire or like a viral thing. Everybody starts building high schools because everybody else is doing it, because there's a movement. And so
it begins in the middle of America in small towns. It's not at Harvard, it's not in Washington, it's in, East Elbow, Iowa. And that we think is really important because it captures the fact that these reform movements, for the most part, begin at the grassroots. And that we believe that transfers directly to what should happen now in America. I mean, really, right now, in the next couple of months, what we ought to be focusing on is not what's happening. I mean, if we're worried about the long run trend, we have to be focusing on trying to have lots and lots of different ideas coming from the grassroots.
Yeah, and a lot of times people ask me, what would be the difference between a we solution and an I solution? And I love this example of high schools because, a lot of those of us who have children today, we feel like our children maybe are not receiving the type of education that's going to prepare them for the economy. Well, that's exactly what people felt during that time. But instead of complaining to Washington about how horrible our schools were, they actually looked around to their neighbors and said, well, do you have the same problem as me? Oh, yeah, we do. We all have children who are not able to receive a secondary education, but they need one now that we're an industrialized economy. And they created the ability for every kid in town to go to a public school. And they didn't look outside of anyone other than themselves and their own community. Now today, an I solution to that would be, well, I'm going to scrape together my money and send my kid to a private school, right? But so today we need to start thinking more about, we all have the same problems here. How can we band together and fix them ourselves? And then maybe those ideas can be adopted in a bipartisan way on the national level.
Right. So, yeah, and so you have rightly emphasized in this conversation so far, has rightly emphasized the upswing, the first part of the curve, because actually that's the misunderstood story, and so I appreciate that, and that's also what we should be paying attention to. But I am curious about the reason for the downturn, and the two, you discuss why the two explanations that sort of I'm left with, but I want to test them with you. One is the 60s. The 60s understood as a traumatic kind of experience, almost the equivalent of a war, the way the First World War would have changed Europe, but didn't change us very much because we weren't so deeply involved. So the 60s, especially the late 60s, as a moment that played out in terms of all the things that happened then that broke that trend. The other explanation I didn't see as explicitly in your writing, but it was the flip side of the upswing. So if a bunch of decentralized people work in their own separate ways to change norms, and they change them towards the we. Couldn't it be that a bunch of people did that in the other direction quite intentionally, starting in the late 60s? So everything from libertarian political philosophers to people busting unions or changing workforces. In other words, that there's actually a bunch of actors too, and in the same way that you have your nice vignettes of 5 actors who caused the upswing, we could talk about 5 actors who caused exemplary actors who caused the downswing. From your perspective, is that possible?
So that's an important, really important question, Peter. I think if we had to pick out one explanation only, which we don't because it's multi-caused,
right?
But probably the single biggest is the one that Shaylyn mentioned, was race. Go for it, Shaylyn, because that actually is an important part of why the reversal happens.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned it already, but just again, this move toward self-protection. I mean, the moment that we actually did legally widen the we to include people of color, white Americans sort of freaked out about it, right? And started doing things to undo that widening. And you just can't ignore that as a huge driver of the story. And of course, we see political realignments that flow from that play out over decades, as well as geographical realignments that play out as a result of that. So there is a lot that flows from that particular phenomenon. So in a way, it becomes this sort of war of the we's, more of a group. It's individual, but also group, if that makes sense.
It does, and that's, yes.
I think the thing that we have a whole chapter, Peter, as you know, on the question of the 60s. We don't think that's the most interesting or the most powerfully relevant question for the reasons we already laid out. We're not trying to figure out how it turned down. We're trying to figure out how it got started up in the first place, because that's where we are now. We don't want to focus on the ending of this upswing. We want to focus on how it got started. That's what people now have to worry about. But it's of course an interesting, an interesting question. And in addition to the issue of race, I think we also, Peter, you know a lot, and many of the audience will know this. Much of the 60s actually happened in the 70s, by which I mean the first half of the 60s was actually a time it was the apotheosis of community. It was, communes and warm hands and cuddly feelings and so on. And then that turned very sharply in 1964-65. I wish I had time, but I won't take time to go through, but we do in the book, actually, popular music, because you can see in popular music of that time, the Beatles, for example, up until about 1966, the Beatles are all about, I want to hold your hand, and so on. And then in the case of the Beatles, you can narrow it. The place when the Beatles turned from a we to an I musical group, you can narrow that down to a couple of months. And the same thing is true so it did happen very quickly. The short answer is the short answer to the cause is in addition to the race thing, is that we think there was a concatenation of otherwise independent crises that weren't themselves caused by the same thing, that all together put America in kind of a nervous breakdown. And it's fun that we go around the country. I'm talking more because this is I actually lived that period. Shaylyn knows about it from the books, and you're too young, Peter, but I lived it. And if you go through the events, different people of different micro generations cite different things. The oldest people talk about the assassinations, and they talk about, the Kennedy assassination and the King assassination, and then the second Kennedy assassination. Other people talk about Vietnam. Many people talk about Vietnam. Other people talk about the pill and the rapid change in sexual mores, and other people talk about the women's movement, and other people talk about, the drug epidemic, and other people talk about Watergate and Nixon, and other people talk about the oil embargoes and so on. Those were not all one single thing, but they happened to so coincide that people who lived through it think it was one thing, when it's actually, if you stand back analytically, it was not one thing. It was this concatenation of otherwise unrelated crises that, as I say, it's not an explanation, I totally agree, but in a way caused a nervous breakdown. Americans generationally just completely split. And that's how we started down the other side of this I curve.
Yep.
Can I just mention a couple things too, just to pick up a couple threads? I think that another thing that we address in the book is that the solution to hyper-individualism is not hyper-communitarianism, right? And so there is an argument to be made that in this we period, we did enter a bit of a mode of hyper-communitarianism that manifested as a push toward conformity. And so bringing out your point, Peter, about actors moving against that, there were people who were saying enough with this we conformist communitarian thing. Like, we want to go in the other direction. And there were definitely cultural actors calling for a change in direction in that regard as well. So that's important. And you know, this also ties back to one of the other lessons from the upswing that we didn't mention, which is there's always a danger of overcorrecting, right? And so I think you see a lot of young people today really drawn into socialism, right, as an answer to today's problems. That was also happening during the previous period as well, during the early 1900s. And there's always this danger of saying, we've gone too far in one direction, let's go way in the other direction, right? And the beauty of the progressive era was that it actually found this pragmatic way forward to balance the twin American ideals of liberty and individualism and equality and communitarianism, right? They found a way to maintain a respect for private property while also making things a bit more equal. And that's, I think, what we're calling for today is, as you've mentioned, not an overcorrection, not a move toward hyper-communitarianism, but some sort of a balance bringing us back to the middle here.
And as Peter well knows, that recognition goes all the way back to the godfather of all this, which is Tocqueville, because Tocqueville is the godfather of communitarianism. He also invented the word individualism, and his solution was what he called self-interest, rightly understood. That if you self-interest is fine, but you've got to understand how your interest is affected by everybody else's behavior and vice versa.
That would actually be an eloquent way to end, but we do have 2 minutes, and we have a lot of questions, and one that I would love to just hear your quick answer to is the social media question, which the social media question, which someone needed to ask, but Michael Ippoliti actually asked it. So what do you think about the prospects for turning the curve around in an era of fake news and
you want me to answer that in 1 minute, Peter? Is that right?
Yeah, you got it, because that's hey.
So, Shaylyn, forgive me. I'm gonna jump in and take that, Peter. What you may not know is that simultaneously with the publication of the Upswing, we are also publishing a 20th anniversary edition of Bowling Alone. And there's only one new chapter in the book, and that chapter is meant to answer the question: can Facebook or TikTok replace bowling leagues? That is to say, the whole point of that afterword is that, and there's a lot. It's a long afterword with hundreds of footnotes. I'll give you I'm going to try to give you the soundbite answer. If you look at the hard data, it's actually quite hard to make a call one way or the other. There's some evidence that looks like, yeah, virtual connections are just as good as face-to-face connections, and there's some evidence that says no, face-to-face are much better than virtual, and the whole damn country is in the middle of an experiment on exactly that, Peter. You could take a poll of Americans right now, do you want to go back to school or not? Do you want to get together for Thanksgiving, or you want to just do the Zoom? And so we're engaged in a huge experiment on that very point. Stepping back a little bit from that, I think I would want to make 2 points. One, it's a mistake to think about this question as if it was either or. Either we have purely virtual or purely real connections, because for all of us now, almost all of our connections are simultaneously a mix of real connections and virtual connections. I mean, I spend a lot of time nowadays Zooming with my grandchildren, but I actually know them face to face, right? So not now, but I mean, it's what chemists sometimes call an alloy. That is a mixture of two different elements. You could have, I never can remember, tin and brass, and you put together to get bronze. But this is the point. The characteristics of bronze are different from either the characteristics of, tin or copper, whatever it is. And these alloys, what I'm really trying to say is, first point is, don't think about internet versus face-to-face. think about alloys and how they differ. There are many different kinds of alloys, and there are many different kinds of mixtures. Finally, and last point, and this is the last point, a summary point for the whole book, is the upswing. Agency.
Great.
Don't think, and this is, I'm speaking now to young people in the audience, do not think that you have to be the victims of something else out there. Technology is forcing you to do a certain kind of thing, or history is forcing you to do a certain kind of thing. The evidence, both from the social media side and from the progressive era side, is that people can make choices that have real consequences. It's fundamental that we not get trapped in this idea that there's nothing we can do because our fate is being determined by, you know, things that happened a long time ago or by forces outside our control. That is simply not true. And the way this country can make further progress in whatever direction we want to go is if people begin to, especially young people, begin to recognize you have real choices. And if you make those choices in connection with your peers, you can change America. That's exactly what the young people did 125 years, 100 years ago. And we could do it now, or rather you can do it now. I'm counting on you.
No, actually, that is the right place to end this discussion, although I wish we could talk for longer, because that's the most important point of the book. I fully agree. I mean, the upward curve was caused by people working to make it happen. The downward, we're not so sure. But that is, I mean, that is the summary. And it's a message of hope, which we pretty desperately need. So on a message of hope, I hope everyone will join me in thanking Shaylyn Romney Garrett and Robert Putnam for joining us tonight. And thank you all for joining us, and looking forward to the next distinguished speaker.
And Bob and Shaylyn, this is Alan Solomon again. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And Peter, that was great.
Thank you all, and thanks to the audience. It was a lot of fun for us.
Mm-hmm.
We're